be wondering why we read that long list of names. And partly it was to see if Ronnie could do it. He did awesome. But the other reason that we did it is because it's such an important preface to this holiday season that we're in. That long list of names has some power-filled clues about how God works in and through us. Ronnie went on with a list, and there's a bunch of men in that list. But what is really surprising is that there are 4 women named in that list from a culture that didn't generally trace any matrilineal heritage whatsoever. But there are 4 women named, and they're so important. The first woman named was Tamar. And Tamar was a woman who married, it's in Genesis 38. She married a man who turned out to be wicked, and so he died. And so she was left a widow. And as was the Levirate rules for marriage, what her brother-in-law was told to do by her father-in-law was have sex with her so she would have a baby and be able to raise up a son to the brother who died. Well, this guy was not about that because that would interfere with his inheritance, so he had sex with her all right, but he kept spilling the seed on the ground is how they put it. So anyhow, she didn't get pregnant. And because God did not like what this guy was doing to his brother's name and his sister-in-law's ability to have a family, he died too. Okay, 2 out of 3 brothers are dead. There's one more brother, and he's still a little young. So Judah says, go back to your father's house, tells Tamar, go back to your father's house and live there as a widow, and as soon as my younger son becomes of age, I'll send him to you so then you can have children. Well, years come and go, and that 3rd brother isn't coming because Judah has, of course, decided this woman is bad luck. And he only has one more son left, so he's not sending him. In the course of time, his wife dies, and so Tamar decides to take matters into her own hands. She hears that her father-in-law is going up to this place where he's keeping the sheep, and so she puts a veil on and stays beside the road, pretending to be a prostitute. So her father-in-law comes along and says, hey, honey, you want to have a good time? And she says, well, what will you pay me? And he promises her, this fine goat from his herd. And she said, but he says he doesn't have it now. He'll have to get it later. And she says, well, leave me your signet ring and your tassel and your staff as a pledge, and then you can go get it and bring it back to me. And so they make that arrangement. They have a good time. And life goes on. And when the father-in-law tries to give her the goat, he sends a servant with the goat. There's no prostitute there. The guy asks all around town. No one ever heard of a prostitute being in that particular place. And so Judah says to his servant, well, we got to stop questioning, or we're going to be the laughing stocks of the countryside. So they let life go on. 3 months later, his daughter-in-law is visibly pregnant. And so this is reported to Judah. He's outraged. His daughter-in-law has clearly been having illegal sex. So he asks for her to be brought to him, and he's going to have her killed. And she comes, and she's got the staff and the tassel and the signet ring, and she says, the man by whom I'm pregnant owns these, and she hands them over. Judah is conscience-stricken, and he says, she's more righteous than I am. I should have sent my 3rd son to her, as the law says. I didn't, therefore she's righteous. I am not, and she gets to live and be part of the family. So that was Tamar, and her name is in the genealogy that begins our New Testament. A woman with no power, treated unjustly, who thinks, by goodness, I'm going to make this work, and she did. And the fact that she did it by having semi-illicit sex with her father-in-law does not cause her to be judged, to be pushed aside. It causes her integrity and force of will and faithfulness to God to be forever recorded in the scriptures that bring us toward Jesus. The next person, the next woman in the list, Rahab, who's in Joshua chapter 2, didn't just pretend to be a prostitute, she was a prostitute. Remember Joshua in the Battle of Jericho? Well, Rahab was a prostitute in Jericho, and some spies are sent to scope out the city, and the king gets word, spies running loose, and so naturally he goes to the prostitute's house, because that's where all the spies hide, I guess, and says, hand over the spies, and she says, oh, you just missed them, they left the city, and minutes ago, if you hurry, you can catch them, and she's hidden the spies under some flax that is going to be woven on the top of the roof. And so then after the king's men have run off, she lets them down over the wall of the city, but before they go, she makes them promise that when they attack the city, they'll spare her and her family. And the spies say, we make that commitment, we promise, but you have to make sure everyone you love is in this building, because if they go outside, I'm not responsible for what happens to them. So they have the Battle of Jericho, Joshua wins, and Rahab and her family go with God's people and become absorbed in the tribe and are married. And Rahab the prostitute becomes an honorable and important member of the family of God. The next person who comes along is Ruth. Ruth happens to be Moabite, and the Old Testament is very clear. You cannot let a Moabite into God's people, even to the 10th generation. Well, Ruth got in. And who Ruth winds up marrying, the story goes on a bit, and I know you know it, but who Ruth winds up marrying is Boaz. And Boaz is an older man. Even though he's very wealthy, he's unmarried in a culture where people marry young. Why is Boaz not married, even though he has so much wealth? I'll tell you why. Guess who his mother was? Rahab. You can just hear all the little families saying to their daughters, you are not marrying that boy. I don't care how much money he has. Do you know what his mother is? And so Boaz grew up with a heart that knew what it was like. Even though he worked hard and was wealthy, he knew what it was like to grow up in a family where he was cherished, where his mother was precious and brave, and his father stood by her and loved her, but the rest of the community were talking behind their backs all the time, and life was frequently hell. And Boaz grew up. And so when Ruth the Moabite came along, and there's this great story about how he's kind to her, lets her glean from his field, because Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, are very poor. And Naomi says, hey, this guy is really akin to us. Remember the old Levirate marriage business? So she says to Naomi, to Ruth one night, just go and after people have settled down, when he lies down to sleep, go and lie down near him. Scripture says she uncovers his feet. Now, I told you what that means last year. And she was not giving him a foot massage. So, that happens, and in the morning when they wake up early, then he says, okay, quick, go before anybody sees you, and I'll see if I can arrange to marry you. And he does. Boaz arranges to marry her, and what he says is that he's noticed how kind she's been to her mother-in-law. He is not someone, I mean, she's drop-dead gorgeous too, But he's not someone who's just looking for some beautiful person to marry, not just beautiful on the outside. He's looking for someone who's beautiful on the inside. And Ruth has been an outsider, an outcast. She's a Moabite. She's kind of dirt, but Naomi has dared to bring her back into the community of God's people. And Boaz's life has prepared him to fall in love with Ruth, to provide a home. And Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of King David, God's beloved. Remember the old never let a Moabite unto the 10th generation? Well, I'm going to tell you, King David is 3rd generation Moabite. Hello, God's chosen king. Step by step by step, God is weaving a story that includes each and every person. People who have been looked down, people who have been shamed, people who have been told they are less than, people who have struggled with bullying. God weaves those lives together in a way that is powerful and important. And then the 4th woman, Bathsheba, who happens, you can read her story in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And some of you have heard, like Sunday school versions, who tells this to little kids? But supposedly Bathsheba was supposed to have seduced King David. That is the biggest lie you have ever heard. Just like people seduced Henry Weinstein, I submit to you, that was not what was happening. You have the King David, who can have any woman he wants by snapping his finger. You really think Bathsheba, whose husband was a soldier in David's army, was out plotting to seduce the king? I think not. I think his house, it was not unusual for people to bathe on the rooftops because there weren't all these separate interior rooms. So that's where you went for privacy. And from other houses, you wouldn't be able to see. But of course, the king's house is high enough. He can do all the voyeurism he wants to. And if he sees a cute woman, he can send for her. And that's what he did. He sent for Bathsheba. And do you think she had an opportunity to say, oh, no, thank you, king. I'm married, another night, perhaps. No way. She had to go. Bathsheba was raped by King David as clear as any victim of sexual abuse has ever been assaulted. And there she was. And she gets pregnant. She becomes, after losing her first baby, and after David has her husband killed, then she becomes one of his wives and becomes the mother of Solomon. Again, God finds ways to weave into God's story with importance and cherishing all of God's people. I'll tell you, in Proverbs, the last chapter in Proverbs 31, King Lemuel is said to have written that, and biblical scholars will tell you that it is really thought to be Solomon. So if Solomon wrote chapter 35 of Proverbs, go home and read it, because in there, the king says, my mother taught me this. And the wisdom that his mother taught him was to care for the poor and needy, protect the voices of those who do not have power. That is not a mistake, that God wove those lives into God's own history to bring us that baby Jesus Christmas morning. And here's the thing. At the end of the genealogy, did you notice who it ended up with? What was the last person in the genealogy? Joseph, not Mary. And remember, Joseph was clear to the innkeeper, this is not my baby. And yet, the genealogy leads up to Joseph. Why does that happen? I submit to you because yet again, God is teaching us that each and every person is precious and has gifts we can use if we let our hearts be nudged. Mary and Jesus would never have survived unless Joseph was the kind of person who would take a nap when he found out his fiancée was pregnant with a child that was not his. Because remember, the angel appeared to him in a dream. So he didn't go out punching people in the face, yelling and screaming, calling the authorities to get Mary. He makes a plan to put her away quietly, and then he sleeps on it, and an angel can come to him in a dream. This genealogy of people who've been outside, of people who've been harmed, of people who've been bullied, have all been woven in to build someone of such character and gentleness and insight that Joseph would be able to put away everything that screamed, "You can't be part of this," and say yes to God. My hope and prayer for all of us in that Christmas season, and not just a Christmas season, in every single day as we go on, that we pay attention to the ways God is weaving us into God's story, the ways God is nudging our hearts, and that we look to the right or the left and see who's being left out, see who's being hurt, and make sure that by God we are standing beside them. In Jesus' name, amen.